You think you know what slavery looked like in history. You've seen the chains, the ships, the fields, the movies that leave you shaken. But what if I told you that the story you've been taught is only a fraction of the truth? What if behind the familiar accounts lies a system so vast, so methodical, and so enduring that it makes 4 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade look like a single dark chapter in a book that spanned more than a millennium? This isn't the story you learned in school. It isn't the story anyone wants to teach because it isn't just about oppression or economics. It's about the deliberate erasure of entire peoples, the transformation of human lives into an inventory system, and the cold, mathematical efficiency with which suffering was managed. This is the story of a hidden slave trade, one that stretched not 400 years, but 1400, one that turned children into soldiers, families into ruins, and civilizations into memories. Imagine for a moment the sound of church bells in a small Balkan village in the year 1515. They aren't a tea ringing for Sunday Mass. They're ringing as a warning. Riders are coming down the dirt road. Soldiers carrying the insignia of the Ottoman Empire. Every mother knows what it means. Every father feels his stomach twist. The collectors have arrived. Government officials march into the square, demanding every boy between the ages of 8 and 18. The families already know there is no bargaining, no appeal. The boys are lined up like livestock at market, teeth inspected, height measured, reflexes tested. Some children are dismissed for being too small, too frail, or imperfect in some way. Others are marked for selection, pulled away as their parents cry and plead. Imagine a father dropping to his knees, offering the family home, every animal, every scrap of wealth he spent a lifetime protecting, only to be told his son is worth more than everything he owns. Imagine the soldiers dragging his boy away as he lunges in desperation, beaten down in the dirt before his child's eyes. This was not random brutality, it was a system, carefully designed and ruthlessly applied. Known as the devshirme, it became the machinery that fed the Ottoman Empire's most elite institution, the Janissaries, a corps of soldiers trained from childhood to fight with unshakable discipline. To ensure loyalty, these children were cut off entirely from their past. They were forbidden to speak their native languages. They were stripped of their names, their families, their identities. In their place, a new allegiance was forged, a loyalty so deep that some of these children, once grown, would return to the very villages they were stolen from, this time as soldiers, collecting the next generation of captives. Think of the psychological devastation. A mother setting an empty place at the dinner table for 30 years, talking to a chair as though her son might walk through the door again. A father who blinded his own child in one eye, reasoning that a maimed boy was better than a stolen one. Entire villages left to crumble because every son was taken, the fields unplowed, the families broken, the community extinguished in a single generation. And yet, for the empire, this was not cruelty, it was bureaucracy. Selection criteria were written down in manuals. Records were kept with meticulous detail. A human life was not seen as a son, a brother, or a student. It was a number on a list, a specimen evaluated for utility. Over centuries, between 200,000 and 500,000 children disappeared into this system. Each one represented not just an individual tragedy, but the unraveling of families and cultures across the Balkans. The tragedy deepens when you realize how thoroughly these children were reshaped. Some rose to extraordinary power, like Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, taken at 10 years old from his Serbian village. Decades later, he stood as the Grand Vizier of the empire, second only to the Sultan himself. From that position of unimaginable authority, he ordered campaigns against his own homeland, sending armies into the same kind of villages where his mother once tried to hand him a piece of bread for the road. Even when he commissioned a bridge in his birthplace, it wasn't a gift, it was a weapon of control, a tool that made future invasions easier. What makes this system so chilling is not just the violence, but the cold logic behind it. These were not children seized in random raids. They were selected, measured, reshaped, and rebuilt into weapons. They weren't merely stolen, they were systematically reprogrammed, their past erased so completely that many grew to embrace the empire that destroyed their families. And here's the part that should make you shiver. This was just the beginning, because while the Devshirme targeted children, another, far darker system targeted men and boys in a way that makes this tragedy look almost merciful by comparison. It was a system that reduced human lives to equations, where a 90% death rate was not a catastrophe, but a calculation. Before I take you into that abyss, let me pause and say this. If you were drawn to stories that peel back the layers of history to reveal what has been hidden, if you want to hear the truths that textbooks never dare to tell, then I invite you to join me here. Subscribe, because this journey isn't just about learning, it's about remembering the lives erased from memory, giving voice to stories buried in silence, because what comes next is a story so disturbing, so methodical, that it may change how you look at history forever. It begins with a simple, chilling equation. 1,000 lives taken, 900 lost, 100 sold for profit, and behind that number lies a practice so haunting that most historians hesitate to speak of it at all. Picture a desert road stretching across North Africa. A chain of captives walks mile after mile under the burning sun. Some stumble, some collapse, and when they fall, they are left where they lie. The survivors keep moving because the march itself is a test. The weak are meant to die. The strong are meant for something worse. Their destination is not a plantation or a battlefield. It is something far more unsettling. Facilities where boys and young men were prepared for roles that made them valuable to the courts of empire. What happened there was so dangerous, so lethal, that out of every 10 who entered, only one survived. Yet those who survived became some of the most prized servants of power. This was the system that transformed living human beings into what empires considered safe. It ensured that they could never form families, never leave legacies, never rebel with descendants at their side. The survivors became administrators, guards, supervisors in palaces and harems, figures who stood close to power, but who had been made incapable of building any power of their own. The cruelty wasn't in secret methods or mysterious tools. It was in the deliberate indifference to survival. More effective techniques existed, knowledge that could have preserved far more lives. But those in charge did not want preservation. They wanted rarity. They wanted survivors who were precious precisely because so many others had died. Dead captives were written off as expenses. The few who endured were investments, commodities that could be sold at 3 or 4 times their original value. The records that survive from Damascus, Cairo, and Basra are among the most haunting in history. They read like ledgers of despair, listing purchase prices, transportation costs, and the final profits from survivors. To the merchants, this was not horror, it was business. A life was worth more broken than whole. Think about what that means. Human lives reduced to arithmetic. Boys and young men valued not for who they were, but for what they were not. Families erased from the inside out. Generations prevented before they could even begin. The scale is staggering. Historians estimate that between 5 and 8 million were forced into this system over the centuries, at mortality rates that defy comprehension. That means millions upon millions died before even reaching their destination. And yet, in our collective memory, this story has nearly vanished. You know about the Atlantic trade. You've heard about the plantations, the ships, the fields. But this was older, longer, and in many ways more destructive. Because it wasn't about building new communities or exploiting labor for generations. It was about erasure, about ensuring that no descendants survived to remember. Perhaps the most haunting example comes from the Zanj rebellion of the 9th century. 500,000 captives forced to work in the salt marshes of Iraq, enduring conditions so brutal that their average life expectancy was just a few years. They rose up, fought for 14 years against overwhelming odds, and when they fell, history nearly erased them. Today, only fragments remain, a few chronicles, a handful of graves, bones etched with the scars of labor that no human body was meant to endure. So why don't we know this story? Why does the memory of one slave trade dominate our imagination, while another, longer, larger, and in some ways more destructive, has been forgotten? The answer is as unsettling as the history itself, because remembering it would mean confronting truths that challenge our narratives of power, religion, and civilization. It would mean facing the reality that human cruelty is not confined to any one empire, any one continent, or any one time period. And that, perhaps, is the darkest lesson of all. Slavery is not just a chapter in history, it is a recurring script written again and again in different languages, across different lands, with different justifications. The names change, the methods evolve, but the core remains the same: the reduction of human lives to numbers, to property, to tools. As we close this journey, I want you to carry one image with you: a mother in a Balkan village setting an empty place at the table for a son who never returned, a father in North Africa watching a line of captives disappear into the desert, knowing he will never see them again, a nameless body buried in salt marshes, bones crumbling under the weight of centuries. These are not statistics, they were people, and their silence echoes through history. If you've made it this far, I want to hear from you. What haunts you most about this hidden history? The scale, the silence, or the way it was deliberately erased? Share your thoughts below, because remembering begins with speaking, and sometimes the act of speaking is the only resistance the past has left us.